If we allow Vanport to be forgotten, it's a part of ourselves. If you can imagine waking up tomorrow and not remembering what happened today, it's important. That's historian talking. Okay, the more we know, the better off we are. And to have something deliberately excised from our history is not good at all. The city of Vanport was a worker city. It was built by the Kaiser Company in order to house their workers who were working in the shipyards in Portland. The city was the brainchild of Henry Kaiser, the industrialist, and it was actually started by his son, who had tried to, not provoke, but to prod the city council into building more houses, because they had thousands of people coming in to work on the ships and no places to stay, and some people were leaving, which would mean that ships were not being built in a timely manner. And you have to recall that the idea behind the shipbuilding was to help win World War II. It was emblematic of the United States in that people came from all 48 states, from the territory of Alaska, from Mexico, and what drew them there were two things. One, it was near the end of the Depression, and so there were jobs available. But the other one, and I think this is much more important, that people were patriotic. They saw a chance to help to win the war, and so they came to this area. It actually began to fill up as it was being constructed. The first people moved in December of 1942, and the city was completed in August of 1943. There were many things going on. We call it a city, but it did not have a municipal government. It was actually governed by the Housing Authority of Portland, but it had all the amenities of a city, except that they had no say in their own government. And one of the very important things is that no one owned property in Vanport. Number two, everybody there had a job. So there's no unemployment in Vanport, because in order to live there, you had to have a job. The city of Vanport grew to be about 40,000 strong by 1944-45. This was the highest population. And the state of mind and feeling of those who moved in differed greatly. For example, one of my friends, Ed Washington, he arrived when he was 7 years of age, asked about it. He thought it was fantastic because it was a big city. His mother, however, he recalls, started crying because it was so crowded. Again, roughly 40,000. They came from Birmingham, where they had their own house and yard, and you could run around. And Vanport was all apartments and very crowded. On the other hand, those who had been living in cars and in theaters and so forth in Portland thought it was wonderful, because you had a completely furnished apartment that you could move into. They were glad that they had a place to live. Vanport's uniqueness, I think, is the fact that it was a microcosm of the U.S. It replicated the U.S. in terms of ethnicity, in terms of origins of people. And I think another thing that was really unique about it is the enthusiasm that the people there had for working. They were patriots. And I think that is probably the most important thing about Vanport, that people learned how to live together and work together. The crews that were building Vanport, for example, was about 1/3 women, which was unheard of. Women didn't do construction, but it was necessary in order to get the place up and running as soon as possible. And when it came to the shipyards, you had blacks and whites, American Indians working together. It was, in the words of James T. Hamilton, a fully functioning democracy. May 30th, 1948, there was a flood. It's erroneously called the Vanport flood, but it's actually the Great Columbia Flood of 1948. The worst natural disaster in the USA in that year. What happened at Vanport was that the Smith Lake rose and rose, and then there was a breakthrough on the western part of Vanport. The folks who were living there were concerned because of the floods coming down the Columbia, but they were told by a note slipped under the doors that they should not worry because the dikes were safe. Ironically, the dikes were safe. And what happened is that the railroad embankment was never meant to be a dike, it was just a fill. And so the water cascaded through it. And you need to realize that Vanport City was constructed in a hollow. It was 14 to 15 feet below river level. And so when the railroad fill broke, it filled up very quickly. The survivors talked about a wave of water, a wall of water coming down, and in less than 45 minutes, the city was all underwater. In 2 hours, it was completely flooded out. And then some people could not make it out. The water came up too quickly. The houses were built on wood platforms rather than concrete, again, so that they could get them up as quickly as possible. And so as the water rose, the apartment units floated. And so people could be seen on the roofs of apartment buildings as they were floating away. The aftermath of the flood is that it took several days before the water started going down. But the people who came out had to be housed, and so the Red Cross took the lead in trying to find places for people. Again, the good thing about a disaster is that people really pulled together. And so even though there was a lot of prejudice in Portland, people opened their doors to the flood victims because there were flood victims. Residents of Vanport became citizens of Portland. And so that spirit that they had engendered there came into Portland. It's the combination of the Vanport people and the old city people who pushed for changes in the city and the state. So that today Portland, for example, is seen as this liberal spot in the West. In 1940s, it was not liberal at all. Most historians credit Vanport, that Vanport story, as being very significant in leading to big changes in the city of Portland. Residents who fled Vanport, some were able to find apartments, but because of restricted covenants and so forth, people of color were generally not able to. The basic area open to people of color was Albina. And so Albina quickly became known as a black area, even though at its greatest, about 40% of the population was black. There was a deliberate attempt to eradicate Vanport. In fact, there is a place we call Delta Park. That's Vanport. So PIR is there. There's a golf course there, which takes probably about half of Vanport. And then there is a flood mitigation area. And some people would like to have it named Vanport. But the city, again, the mayor at that time, and most of the city council didn't want Vanport in the first place. And as soon as it was gone, they were so happy, they wanted to eradicate any vestige of the city. And so there was nothing left that was named Vanport, except the MAX station, which is called Vanport Delta Park. So that's all that's left.
I'm gonna hold it and tell you, then come under my command.
Why has this particular city been obliterated from most histories? I've spoken with people who, I'm not from this area, I've only been here since the 1970s, but I speak with people who grew up here, and I mentioned Vanport, and it's one or two things. For the older folks, it's, oh, the flood. For the younger folks, it's, what's that? So the question is, why has it been obliterated, deliberately obliterated? Because it was a success. And it is part of our history, but it's not part of our history if we don't know about it. And I think it's something that Portlanders can be proud of if they only knew that the Portland area produced half the ships that went out into the Pacific to help win the war. We talk about the war, but we don't talk about the domestic army, the people who helped win the war. That's important, but we don't know it. We don't know that there were people who fought against discrimination in the shipyards, which is very important. The Spirit of Vanport. Let's help each other. Let's get along. Let's stand up for democracy. Let's stand up for humanity.